right, so it is 1:59 where I live, which means it's 1 minute until the start of the presentations here. Elizabeth Berger is my moderator, and she's also going to present a couple of her quilts too. So she's going to be kind of busy letting people in. If I can recommend that you just keep yourself muted, because that is going to give us the best recording quality, and it's just going to be the least amount of distraction. If you do have questions or comments, feel free to use the chat function, which is, it says chat, and it's got a little bitty thought bubble, and you're going to click on that, and then you can type in your message. The thing that you want to make sure that say everyone, and that means that what you're typing will go to everyone. If you end up sending it just to one person, well, then just one person is going to get it. So if you have questions, put them in the chat. Let's see. Okay. Wow, I'm super excited that this is happening. Well, I have a little slideshow. I've got a couple of things to talk about at the very beginning. And so I'm just going to get the show going. Does Elizabeth, is there anything you can think of just that you want to share? People need to stay on mute. You can have your video on if you want to. If you're more comfortable without the video on, that's fine. Well, I'll just start the slideshow, and then
wait, before you do, will this recording be available?
Yeah, the recording will be available. I'm going to put it on my YouTube channel. I think it'll be the first thing that's actually there, and it will be called the BIG TADA 2022, so that you know it's this particular year. And yeah, it will be available, and I'll probably send out a link, and maybe even we'll put a link on my Instagram for a little while, Elizabeth, right?
And then it'll be available for 30 days or so?
I think it'll be just available, unless I'll just have it on my YouTube account. Okay. Let me pull up the slideshow. So the way this is going to work today is that, so first of all, welcome to Stitching Towards Discovery, the BIG TADA. And to give you a little bit of an explanation of what this is that back in January, I started a class called Stitching Towards Discovery. And there were 23 students when we started out, and there are 16 of them giving presentations today. That feels pretty good. We met twice a month. We had a formal session, which was 3 hours long. And during that session, we had guest speakers, and we covered topics such as goal setting, working in a series, drawing as a tool for quilt makers, entering shows, a judge's perspective, and the artistic process. And those lectures were given by these guest speakers, which is kind of a rock star roster. Lisa Call, Susan Lapham, Kristen Link, Heather Prager, Karen Stone, and Irene Roderick. And then during the second session of the month, so there were two sessions, one was the formal session, and then the second session was, I call it a study group, and we would meet to have conversations and share our work, get feedback, and they were a more informal session. Both of these sessions were recorded every month, and the students have them until the end of this year, until the end of 2022. Additionally, we had a private Facebook group, which was very supportive. The group of people that signed up for this class were just incredible, and the way that they were kind and thoughtful with each other. And we talked about an assortment of things. Some of them were kind of touchy subjects. I was thinking in particular, like appropriation in quilt making, and then other, like I was laughing to myself today that another touchy topic might be applique combined with piecing, or ironing your seams open or closed. We talked about a lot of different things. And during this whole time, I also was giving students 3 prompts a month. And the prompts are basically an idea or a creative jumpstart, a place to start thinking about your work. And the prompts were organized in this way. One prompt would be a formal design prompt, like line or shape or color. The next prompt I called Under the Influence, which basically sharing a particular artist's work, and then encouraging students to create a quilt that might be in conversation with that artist's work. So not duplicating another artist's work, but really sort of responding to it in what I think of as a visual conversation. And then the last prompt I call the wild card prompt, and it's basically something that I was thinking about that might be a cool thing to experiment with in making a quilt. One of those prompts was to make a COVID quilt. Another one was about politics in your quilting. Just one time it was ocean, just sort of things that I had been thinking about, and I was kind of curious to see what my students would do with a prompt like that. And all of this is leading up to students preparing 4 to 6 new quilts to share in the Big Tada, which is what we're doing right now. And it's a student showcase of basically portfolios for the students that are presenting. We are going to offer Stitching Towards Discovery again in January 2023. So it will be primarily the same. You know, Elizabeth and I are going to talk to the students from this session to get some feedback on how to structure it. But I think a lot of things are going to be the same, that we're going to meet twice a month. We're going to have speakers. We're going to have opportunities for feedback and conversation and community. And then, of course, we will end with the Big Tada like we're doing today. You can find this information at mariashell.com/events/ that is the area of my website where you can sign up for classes. And then 2 other classes that I wanted to sort of draw your attention to is the next class I have coming up is Circle and Curve Sampler, and it starts on August 2nd. So most of my classes, just to give you an idea of what a virtual class with me is like, typically we meet once a week, 4 sessions, which cover approximately a month-long period. And during that time, you will have, there'll be lectures and there'll be student consults and conversations. And then hopefully by the end of it, you will have finished a quilt. These sessions are recorded and you have access to the recording for approximately 45 days after the class ends. And I do this once a month. So the one, whoops, this is the wrong slide. This is the slide I want. The next month's slide, next month's class is Circle and Curve Sampler. And I'm also doing a couple of intensives and a couple of like a short format classes that happen over the weekend. And the other thing I wanted to bring up is this quick class called Intro to Improv, which I'll be teaching on Saturday, August 6th. And it is, if you've never taken a class from me and you're kind of curious about what my classes are like, what you might learn. And this is a good example. It's very inexpensive, $30. It's a 3-hour class. We're going to do 3 things in this class. We're going to talk about pulling a palette. Some of you may be familiar with the 12-color palette that I often use with my students when we're doing a workshop. So we'll hone in on what that 12-color palette is. The second thing that we're going to be doing is sort of my approach to improv, how I press, iron, prep my fabrics, cut, stitch, all of that. And then the last thing that we'll be doing is we'll be making these, I call them cave cannon blocks. They're a variation on the log cabin. So by the end of the class, I'm hoping everybody will have a log cabin block that they can turn into a pillow, or if they really like it, they might make an entire quilt. It's this particular block that you're looking at here in this quilt. Okay, so those of you who have been in class with me before may have actually heard this quote, but I thought it was very appropriate for today, so I'm going to share it with you. And it's a quote from Derek Sievers. When you experience someone else's, parentheses, genius work, I'm going to say quilt though, when you experience someone else's quilt, a little part of you feels that's what I could have done, would have done, and should have done. Someone else did it, You didn't. They fought the resistance. You gave in to distractions. They made it a top priority. You said you'd get to it someday. They took the time. You meant to. When this happens, you can take it two ways. You could let that part of you give up. Oh, well, I don't need to make that quilt anymore. Or you could do something about that jealous pain. Shut off your phone, kill the distractions, make it a top priority, and spend the time. It takes many hours to make what you want to make. The hours don't suddenly appear. You have to steal them from comfort. And the reason I thought that this quote was so appropriate for today is because all of these students have done exactly that. And I'm gonna get emotional. It's kind of crazy, like the amount of work, and you'll see it in these presentations, that these students dedicated themselves to working really hard since January. And their results are really mind-boggling, and I'm really proud of their efforts. Okay, so this is the Big Tada. And of course, Mallory Shannon does the Big Tada better than almost anybody else. So the way that it's going to work, I'll go back here for 1 second, is that each student has submitted a portfolio to me, which I have formatted. And we're going in alphabetical order, except for Barbara Wistinger, because Barbara has been taking this class from Amman, and she's actually in Europe right now, but she isn't sure that her internet connection will be strong enough. So there are two students that I'm going to be reading their presentations. So there are approximately 6 quilts, and each student is going to talk about their journey, what they learned, what they're going to do next, really just talk about their work. All right, so we're going to start with Barbara Wistinger, who lives in Amman, Jordan, but is originally from Austria. So, whoops, we're pretending I'm Barbara. I am Barbara Wistinger Strata from Vienna, Austria, at present living in Jordan.
Okay, that works.
I joined Stitching Towards Discovery, not only to learn and explore more about quilting, but also to go on a path to eventually find my voice in this artwork. I tried to keep up with a professional approach to this workshop, which was quite challenging due to the time change and my other commitments. Working hard with lots of interest and joy made it work. My first challenge, I chose monochromatic, as I love playing with color. Winter Blues is inspired by the Korean bojagi, a wrapping cloth. I decided to make both quilts big enough to keep me warm on those cold gray days. The next quilt you see was actually a commission, which I made parallel to the Winter Blues quilt. It had to be queen size, no small pattern, and preferably something with a round element. I chose to use very fine linen leftovers, which was quite difficult to work with, but a joy to look at. I hand quilted with big stitches. My approach to the third prompt, go macro, unfortunately was not very successful, so I put it aside and decided to practice sewing maquettes. Triangle study was created. 6 different ways of the same triangle setting, a project I still have many ideas for. So this will be continued in the fall. Being very fond of textiles and fabrics, I right away knew my solution to the fourth prompt, line. I created stripes in fresh spring colors. There is more than 70 meters of hand quilting, and lots of joy went into composing this quilt. The next piece I started about 15 years ago with the colorful center diagonal. At the time, I did not know what to do with it. I was not experienced enough, and I had no idea about improv quilting. I was inspired by Hilma af Klint, who only allowed her paintings to be shown 20 years after her death because she felt people were not ready for her art. I felt confident and ready now with my piece. I found a way to integrate the fragment into a quilt. For me, the hand quilting with a similar pattern makes the negative space interesting and supports the colorful diagonal. The quilting added a lot to the composition and completed the piece nicely in my eyes. Wabi-Sabi. Find the beauty in the unusual in the way as it is. As is my creation out of cutoffs from a small linen factory back home. I decided to take my scraps as they were and assemble them without trimming or cutting. They had to stay in their original shape. The empty actual negative space in the center was then inset with an improv piece of reds. Suddenly, this turned into the dominant design of this interestingly shaped quilt. Again, big stitch hand quilting finishes the quilt. Last but not least, I would like to show you two more of my quilts, not sewn during this seminar. Na Menlos, in memory of all the known and unknown people walking over the old wooden herringbone parquet in the apartment I grew up in Vienna, and Fields of Life, a very personal wedding quilt for my sister. I like to tell a story with my quilts, as is evident in my work. I'm drawn towards a reduced design supported with a lot of negative space with hand quilting. This is my way to express my voice. Thank you, Barbara, very much for sharing that with us. And Jerry Otti is our next presenter. So she's going to unmute herself and talk a little bit about her work.
Okay, so can you hear me, Maria?
Yeah.
Okay, so this is me, and I live in on the peninsula of Washington State, just a ferry ride away from Seattle. And I have been what I would call an occasional quilter till the pandemic hit. I we live in a couple of different places. We have a house in England, we have a boat, and we actually have a house here. So I would always quilt when I was in the place where my sewing machine was, which happened to be in England. So the pandemic, as horrible as it's been, was a real godsend to me. And I'm in front of one of my favorite quilts right now. And if you want to move to the next one, Maria, this is called Fantasy Trees. And one of the people who most has inspired me over the last few years is Hildy Moran, who is a quilter who lives in Portland, Oregon, and she's really into curved piecing. And I took this class with Hildy a few years ago and was just gobsmacked. It's so much different than doing box and putting together as a quilt. So this is one of my favorite pieces. It's called Fantasy Forest. And if you want to go ahead, Maria, to the next one. And as a result of the pandemic hitting, we actually could have ended up in 3 different places, but we ended up living here in the US. And because we couldn't go back to England, and because we couldn't go get our boat in Alaska, we ended up staying here for 2 years. And I was fortunate enough to be able to hook into Maria and take several classes from her. And this is the one quilt that I actually finished during the class. And this is from her kitchen sink series of classes. And this actually contains about 5 or 6 pieces, different pieces from different quilts that I've done in the past. And I put them together in this, what she calls the kitchen sink quilt. And I quite love it. And you'll also see in this quilt that one of the things that comes out is my love of graphic design, as well as my love of pieced quilting, which is something that I picked up for Hildy Moran. So next one. And so what I decided to do in this series, this class that I just took with Maria, is to actually, because I not only took the kitchen sink quilting class, I took like 3 or 4, 5, or maybe 6 others, because I was so enthralled with this whole process. So the problem is that I never finished anything. So when I decided to take this Stitching to Discovery class with Maria, I thought, well, this is an opportunity for me to finish things and also to put them together in a series, which is something that I've never done. So this is the first of the series of 4 that I've done. And I think there's 2 more in the offing. when I have a chance to do them. But this one is called Shipping News, and it's all about, so when I lived in England, I used to listen to the shipping news on the BBC at 5 o'clock in the morning as I was driving to work. And then we actually bought a boat and we spent a lot of time in Alaska. So to me, it's all about the winds, the waves, and what happens when you're out on the water. So this is the first of the series. And you can go to the next one. And this is the second of the series. And this is from Maria's Curves and Lines Sampler class. And what I did was I took the pieces that I made in the original class and I put them into a series. So that meant that they had to be 40 by 40 inches. They had to be somewhat of a medallion, and they had to work together with the other. So this one is called Knots and Crosses, which is the British term for tic-tac-toe. And I'm looking forward to really quilting this one because I have some really interesting ideas on what to do with it. So the next one is called Earth Strata. And one of the things that has been really inspirational to me is our boat trips to Alaska, Southeast Alaska in particular. So we've gone to see a lot of glaciers, just a lot of scenery out there, and it's just phenomenal. So this piece to me represents the land in Alaska, the mountains in Alaska, the ice in Alaska, just how everything is just kind of layered together. And also the palette of Alaska, because it's not just all gray. There's lots of brights in it as well. So this is my ode to Alaska called Earth Strata. And the last one, this one, it's called Cityscape right now, but I think it needs to be called Urban Mayhem. So this is from another class that I took with Maria, and I actually played a lot with what the pieces I had from this class and put them together. I'm not sure I'm quite there yet, but part of it I really, really like. And I've never lived in a big city. So to me, this is what big cities look like. So the next class, the next picture is, so one of the things that has been interesting to me, and this is one of the things that happened in Marie's class, is we had a speaker, Irene Roderick, who I didn't really know anything about. And she came and spoke to us. And then I found out during her talk with us that she was actually teaching a class not too far from where I live. And so I fortunately was able to get into that class for 3 of the 5 days that she was teaching. And what she really opened my eyes to is the fact that I don't have to be on the grid. I don't have to plan everything out. I actually can put something on the wall and figure out how things interact with it and come up with what does the quilt need next. So this piece right now is my first piece via our AKA Irene, and I'm pleased with it so far. I will finish it, but I've learned a lot about just kind of opening my eyes to what the piece wants and not necessarily what I want to happen. And yeah, so it's been fun. That was really, really fun. And so we'll see how this one develops. So the next one, this is one of the funnest things I've done this last year is I had a commission piece that I spent 4 months doing. And these were a couple in Port Townsend, Washington, which is not too far from me, who really, really are outdoors people. And they actually spent a lot of time swimming in the Straits of Juan de Fuca. So after talking to them for a long time, this is a 31 by 78-inch piece. I came up with this, and it's just been accepted into one of the quilt shows, the local quilt shows here, which I'm really excited about. So I will just close with that. And actually, I have to say one more thing, Maria. I have to say that all of the people that really have inspired me, Hildy Moran, you, and Irene, in retrospect, actually, are part of this piece because I've learned so much from all of you. So now I think my next challenge is trying to figure out what is my actual own voice and how do I actually move forward with that?
Great, thank you, Jerry. Our next speaker is Elizabeth. And one thing I'd like to say right now before Elizabeth speaks is that when you speak, if you can turn your video on, and then I can find you and highlight you as you're talking. So Elizabeth, who is also my moderator and I think everyone's best friend in this class. So Elizabeth, what'd you do this year?
I had the wonderful opportunity to watch everyone in this class and also sew myself. And it was wonderfully inspiring. So you can start with my first slide. Thank you. Okay. This was the beginning of a drunkard's path block, but then many drunkard's path blocks. And it was matchstick quilted by me. And I call it the R train because we have friends moving to Brooklyn and we took the R train a lot once we got to New York to see them. And to me, it's a lot of moving parts and a lot of moving, albeit not really subway cars, but sure. So yes, and I used my stash. I didn't pull a pallet. I pulled what I had and tried to make it work. And in hindsight, that's harder. I have a lot more colors now. Thank you, Maria. Okay, next slide. Omagari. This is a mix of fabrics. I used kimono fabric. A good friend has bags and bags of kimono fabrics. So I asked for some scraps and she just said, come and pick. So the white is cotton, everything else is kimono, and they're different weights. So omagari are the pathways in a Japanese garden, and I big stitched in a circle, meaning that all pathways would kind of lead to each other or lead to the center. So this was a lot of fun to sew with, and the fabric was fun to play with, to be honest. So it was good inspiration. The Song of Purple Summer. This started, there is purple, it looks brown on screen, but it is purple. In progress still, but this was, I don't know, organically grew into some sprouting, which is what my husband said. And also what Dave said, it's also, sprouting, which I think is what I love about the puzzle of improv, is you don't know where you're going to go. No ruler, right? Just a rotary cutter, no pattern. This was fun. This is in progress, still going. It'll get bigger. Okay, next one. Immersed. I'm obsessed with this quilt. Immersed because this was flow state quilting to me. I didn't want to stop. I still want to make pieces. There's pieces still coming out of this. There's going to be more to this one. I lost myself in this quilt and it was the best, most freeing, most wonderful feeling. And I can't wait to quilt it. So thank you, Maria.
Thank you, Elizabeth. All right, and we're back to me again. There's two presentations that I'm reading, and this is from Belinda Betts. My name is Belinda Betts. I'm sorry I can't be here today to present in person. Both my parents are unwell and I am their caregiver. However, Maria said she will read this out loud, so I can at least be there in spirit. I live in Orange, New South Wales in Australia, and I'm a long arm quilter, small fabric shop owner, wife, mother, and caregiver. For several years now, I've been just sewing because I love it, with no creativity involved, following other people's patterns and ideas. This has not been satisfactory, and when this workshop of Maria's became available, I thought now is the time to actually get my act together and be creative and not look at others being creative. I've managed to design and create 6 pieces in the last 7 months. There was a lot of doubt, indecision, bad words, rearranging, throwing of pieces, and ultimately satisfaction with the results, mostly. This was my first quilt. It is 43.5 inches square and was a result of the Frank Stella prompt. I was very taken with these shapes and happened to have a ruler which gave me these shapes without too much angst. I decided that I wanted to use pattern fabric rather than just plain solids. So this is the result. It's not quilted and I'm still mulling over how to quilt it. Initially, I was thinking how busy it was, but in the end, it is the simplest of the lot. In contrast, this quilt is totally over the top color explosion. I decided to continue with the curves and put in some black and white, which I'm very partial to, as I think it lifts everything. On a side note, when I was deciding whether to use black and white, one of my thoughts was that I couldn't use black and white in all my quilts because then they are all the same and people won't want to look at them. I did have a light bulb moment there and I realized that I shouldn't care what others think. This is my design and my quilt, and I can do what I want. Continuing the theme of circles, curves, and black and white, I designed this quilt on EQ8. I thought about what other quilt design styles I really enjoy making, and I'm very partial to color movement and Bargello. While this is not strictly a Bargello, the color flow across the quilt is part of the design process. I found the background green and purple colors to be very easy to manipulate, and they made me happy. There weren't too many bad words or indecision in this quilt, except for where to put, I've lost it. The makeup of the center randomness was the extent of the controlledness there was in this quilt. It's made up of pieces of circles. It is 61 by 70. This quilt I designed on EQ8 as a result of the Oceans prompt. It's 71.5 inches square and is quilted and bound. I can't really explain the design process for this quilt as it just sort of happened. I'm very pleased with it. And once the initial decisions about how to make shapes were made, it was really just slogging through the millions of curves, half square triangles, and bits of thin curve. Interestingly, it doesn't have black and white in it. I did try to squeeze it in, but its inclusion spoiled and changed the whole look of the design. I'm happy with it, but it's not as exciting as the previous two, in my opinion. This little quilt is a result of using a song as a prompt. I decided on Happy by Pharrell Williams, and it made me happy to make it. Interestingly, there is not black and white in this either, but it has the curves and the checkerboards. I'm thinking that this design could be a pattern. Also, interestingly, I was making it when my mom was diagnosed with lung cancer. So it was something airy and light while dealing with all the grump. The small strips are all pieced. The fabric was cut at 3/4 of an inch. I wanted to try more ovid shapes, and they were more problematic than the plain circles. However, I drew templates for the curves, and with the aid of a lot of pins, it all worked. Finally, back to the curves and black and white. Phew. I designed this one on EQ8 too, but this is not what the original design looked like. It was very symmetrical, and I was feeling a bit rebellious, so I played with the randomness button, which rearranged the blocks randomly until I found a design which I liked. I knew I didn't want great swaths of plain color, so I pieced the blocks with different fabrics with mostly the same tonality. I'm not sure I could have made this design without having a sheet of paper in front of me indicating which colors went where, as my brain was overloaded with family things. So the improv and randomness only went so far, and then I went back to my trusty rulers and templates. It is unnamed and unquilted. So that's it from Down Under. I've really enjoyed this course with the guest speakers, prompts, input from the Facebook group, and general information. I plan to continue and have started another one which has a black background and will have curves and white too. Thank you. Rose Daly is our next presenter.
I'll put you on mute. Hi, I'm Rose Daly. I've been quilting for about 10 years and really looked into quilts as art, probably only for the last 2 or 3. So I've been exploring a lot. I've taken a lot of classes. I'm kind of known for taking a lot of classes, and I've been fortunate to take classes from people in all different time zones around the world. So it's really opened my mind to a lot of possibilities. The design process is really the part that I find most fascinating about quilting. And also playing with color and different techniques. There's so many possibilities out there, and there's almost an infinite amount to learn. So I took this class more to find my voice and also to get myself into a quilting practice and being able to quilt on the road. I haven't had a permanent residence for about 9 months now and won't for probably another 2 years. So that's added another twist to teach me how to quilt just about anywhere I was. So next slide, please. So a lot of these quilts are from samples that I've taken in classes in the last couple of years to just kind of capture what my voice looks like. I like curves, right? And I also like the secondary patterns that you can create using traditional blocks or using more standard blocks to create secondary shapes and other forms. So both of these quilts, I took a class with Melanie Touzon, and then I applied it into a quilt challenge for QuiltCon a couple of years ago. These are just a standard Drucker's Path block, and depending on how you put the fabrics together, you can create all these additional shapes. Next slide, please. And then I also have been, during COVID, really exploring my stash, as so many of us have, and challenging myself to use prints in unexpected ways. So this was a class I took with Heather Kojan using an interleave technique, which uses very narrow strips that you interleave together to create a pattern. And I took 4 prints that really don't go together if you just stack them. But when I use this technique and curved it in certain ways, it created a really nice pattern that I was really happy with. So continuing with the techniques idea, here's a log cabin block from a class I took with Katie Pasquini Massapus. And it's a quilt I finished during this class. I like to experiment with color as well. The inspiration prompt for this quilt was a picture of fjords in New Zealand. So you can see the mountains coming down and the water below. But I wanted to play with color a little bit. It was pretty monochromatic. So I added in yellows and fuchsias, which there aren't very many mountains that are that color. So next slide. I've also really started to integrate negative space into my work, and in particular using that space to augment the ideas that I have in the main quilt. So this is a quilt that I did with Brenda Gale Smith. I call it Reach, and I was trying to capture how a plant goes and reaches out into its environment and draws in sunlight and minerals and nutrients from the air and all the things that it needs, but it's not just cut off from that environment. So you can see the quilting in the background is extending out into that negative space to give that feeling, I think. And now to the quilt I did in Maria's class, and you can see these elements are all starting to come together. So this first one was a combination of prompts, the shape prompt, and also looking at Frank Stila, how he had Frank Stila had very regular lines in his work. The shape I actually chose is actually a quarter of that oval, and when you rearrange it, you create new shapes. And so I ended up with these ovals that I used ombre fabric so that I got a little more depth and movement to them. And I've left myself plenty of negative space that I can work with to extend the ideas out. It's probably going to be a radiating kind of a design for this one too, but this isn't quilted yet either. And then lastly, this work, this was really a challenge. So this was a Wabi-Sabi prompt, and the things I focused on about Wabi-Sabi were the ideas of imperfection and impermanence. So I used found fabrics. I actually left California with 17 shirt backs and a background fabric. And then I pieced the waves in San Francisco and in Washington State at my brother-in-law and sister-in-law's house. I did my initial assembly layout in Boise, Idaho. I discovered I really needed those extra pops of color that got pieced in somewhere going across the Midwest. I don't know, South Dakota maybe. And then I did the initial actual construction was at a quilt retreat in West Virginia, and I finished it in my stepson's basement in Rhode Island. So you can sew anywhere, you really can. So as I go forward, you know, obviously I'm going to quilt some of these quilts that I have. And in particular, I'd like to start to add the ideas of hand stitching to give a little more variety in the quilting than what I've been doing. And I have at least 2 more quilts from prompts from Maria's class that I've got either on paper or partially constructed that I'll still finish. So that's it.
Great, thank you, Rose. And now, Jane Eyes.
Good afternoon. I'm looking forward to sharing my work with you and amazed at the work we're seeing from everyone else. It's been a great experience. I'm in Westport, Connecticut. I've been quilting for a very long time, and as my quilt journey progressed, I'm very much into improv quilts, and Maria's been gracious with welcoming it more improvers and people who have sort of really embraced improv, and that's been very nice to be embraced that way too. First slide, please. This is a COVID quilt that I started in early January to warm up for this class, Stitching Towards Discovery. The printed fabrics all feature lettering. This piece started out as a Carol Lyles Shaw technique using 4 10-inch Drunkard path blocks to create a large circle, and then slashing, slicing, and inserting strips of various widths and complexity. My intention was to represent the explosion of social media and the rise of disinformation. Next slide. This is Caprese salad. It is now what became my tomato series. I created this in Maria's Big Botany class in 2020. It was my first experience with making lots of bits, editing the bits, making more bits, and then I realized that you had to really set your intention for the size of all of your individual bits very early in the process so that eventually they would all fit together. And I'm taken with the picnic cloth in the corners, and you'll see that again later. Next, please. This is Kaleidoscope. I created this in Maria's On the Grid class in March 2021. While it is not part of my tomato series, the palette echoes the greens, reds, and oranges in the series and is the beginning of my work with a variety of improv log cabins. I established the basic design and then created templates to guide me as I built the improv triangles. I created this piece in response to the Frank Stella prompt, and then added the Vincent van Gogh sky as the background. Once I had created each of the large circles, and the sky circles, I created a map to decide how you would piece it together, piecing those circles, and I've gotten very good at large circles. Next. This is On the Vine, and I used Carol Lyles Shaw's improv technique again, starting with 8-inch Drunkard's Path squares and my tomato palette. In order to create some continuity among the blocks, I sewed a red-orange curved strip into the 1/4-inch white circles and established rules for the inserted strips. And my final tomato piece is I say tomato, you say tomato. Lots of log cabin elements, my tomato palette, and a blue willow platter reminiscent of the picnic cloth in Caprese salad. Setting the tomato medallion on point created the space for the blue platter. I rarely add borders to my pieces, but in this case, I felt it helped tame the wonky blue triangles. I've learned so much in this 6-month journey with Maria. Her thoughtful and insightful guidance through the design process has added new skills to my improv piecing arsenal and a growing appreciation for what it takes to keep focused on doing the work. I've also really appreciated the other members of the group for their support and insightful comments on our Facebook group, and to Elizabeth for her tech support and urging me to stick with the tomato series. So if anybody knows a pizza parlor that wants a tomato series for a gallery display, let me know.
Thank you, Jane. I love the tomato series. All right, Cappy Flanagan is our next presenter.
Hi, I'm Kathy Flanagan, and I live in Weaverville, North Carolina, which is very close to Asheville. I moved here only 2 years ago. Yeah, 2 years ago. after living in California for 30 years. So it's been a big change and a lot of adjustments. But I have got a bigger space. You can see I'm standing in front of my long arm. I got a bigger space for a bigger studio. And that was well worth the move. Okay, the first slide. So when I started art quilting, I've been quilting for about 12 years, but first started very much bed quilts and retrieving old fabrics and never buying fabric, but just using old clothes. But I started making art quilts about 6 years ago, maybe, but didn't really know what I was doing. I was still using patterns, still using templates. This quilt, COVID Chaos, actually was done before the class started, but this quilt was right out of Maria's book, which I bought and just followed the instructions pretty much. I mean, I just had so much fun making this quilt. It's actually sold, it's gone now, but I really enjoyed it. And this really started my journey with Maria. So in January, you can go in January. Well, these are kind of not a sequence for me. That's okay. This is the way I put it. In January, I had started dyeing fabric of my own. So this was my first experimentation with my own hand-dyed fabrics. You can probably see the difference in the saturation of these. And I just played around with 2-color studies. And then of course, just sort of transitioned from one color to another. But this was again, out of the strip piecing techniques. This quilt is not very big. It's probably only about 40 by 40 maybe, or even less, 30 by 30. This was a quilt. This was the first quilt I started in January for the class. And it was a prompt actually from, I think it was Lisa's lecture about getting organized, or maybe even our conversations about really we had to get organized and make a plan for how we were going to complete 6 quilts. And so this was a cleanup of my studio. And I had this quilt that I made in a class with Maria, the curved sampler class, but I hated it. I just hated the way it turned out. So I took it and I cut it up and then I sewed it all back together. So this was the first quilt I made in January. It's now quilted, completely quilted, and yeah. And then this quilt was a discussion with Maria when she said, I actually totally misinterpreted it, but when she said, make a quilt that's just you. And it took me a while to think about that. And I thought, well, what is me? You know, I thought, well, I'm going to make a quilt about this new place that I live called Asheville. So, and these are also hand-dyed fabrics from what I've been learning to do. Oh, I'd never sent you the completed. This isn't the completed picture, unfortunately, but that's okay. The French Broad River, lots of different things from Asheville. And this was a lot of fun, actually, to make, again, using the same kinds of techniques, making bits and pieces. This one's completely quilted as well. And actually, it's a little different than it looks. That one doesn't look completed, but sorry, I didn't send you an updated picture. Now, this was a quilt that I went to Nancy Crow in the beginning of June for 2 weeks. This was one of the quilts that came from out of her exercise, out of her class, that was a really kind of a head twister. You had to, first of all, have a motif and elongate it, super, super elongate it. And on the left-hand part of the quilt, you had to have everything on the left hand, and on the right hand, the same amount of pieces, but they had to be sort of the opposite. So in one side where it had to be flat, the other side had to be glowing. so it was and then in the center was called the repetition. You had to repeat, repeat, repeat in different ways, sort of the motif. So this came out of that class. I finished it when I got home. It was a lot of fun again to make. I don't know how successful it was. I kind of like it though. I like the way it ended up, so I'm okay with it. Not quilted, but done.
Great. Well, thank you, Kathy. And I should say, any problems with this presentation, with these presentations, is my fault. So hopefully.
I had another quilt, the plaid quilt.
Oh, yes, we do.
Oh, yeah,
Sorry,
okay.
Kathy.
And then when you get home from a Nancy Crow workshop, at least when I came home, I felt like I didn't know anything. And so it was really kind of therapeutic for me to get back to something I knew how to do. And this actually came out of a bag of fabric, a gallon bag of fabric that I bought at a quilt show where they had this room where all the women were dead. And it was all their stuff that they were selling. It was one of the funniest vendor sales I've ever been to. But anyway, so for $2, I bought this huge bag and they're all hand woven plaids. So it was kind of a pain in the neck as far as, how they were unravel, but it was very fun to make. I just finished this. So, and thank you, Maria. This was really just an amazing, amazing journey. And I think the group was so great. It kept us all working hard for each other in a way. And I think that that's really important. I think when there were so many of us, it was too hard to connect. Once the group sort of reduced itself, it was a lot easier to connect with everybody. And Elizabeth, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you for all your help. So that's it.
All right. Thank you, Kathy. Sorry about that. I feel like all season long, I've been messing with Kathy's slides for whatever reason. So now, not intentionally, some random mistake I keep making over and over again. Sarah, are you out there?
Yeah, I am. Thanks so much. I'm Sarah Flynn. I took this class with Maria Shell just because I couldn't resist taking it. I was really excited to not just find my voice, but like define my voice because it is so loud and it goes out of my head so fast that I needed help like figuring out what I was saying and where I was coming from. And I just really have learned so much through this class. I really appreciate it. So I love unwanted fabric, free, old, weird fabric. I like to make big blocks and quilts that make a statement. All right, next slide. This is my Loudmouth quilts. I love that I could do some applique and piecing, so the teeth are appliqued. I love using, like I said, weird and old fabrics. So I use a lot of vintage fabrics in this pieces and created a 4x4 grid. I created a mini quilt at the bottom that was part of my Guild's Rainbow mini show. And I loved it. I showed this at Sisters and I love this quilt so much. And it's hanging in my home right now. And it's one of my favorite pieces. Right, next slide. This is my here to kick ass and chew bubble gum, and I'm all out of bubble gum quilts. I used scraps and letters and allowed myself to cut into that special 90s 80s fabric I've been saving and created this piece. This is my daughter Johnny. She wants to say hi. Sorry, I'm watching my kids today. So yeah, I love this quilt. I love how it came out. It's kind of got away from the grid and I'm just really happy with it. All right, next slide.
Ooh, I like that one.
You
I have
like one?
never seen it.
Yeah, this is my dance hall days one, and I love how it came out. I volunteer with my quilt guild, the Portland Modern Quilt Guild, and I help create a series of block of the month blocks, and they're very big. They're 18-inch blocks, and I used fabrics again that I've been saving, and I love the juxtaposition of the neon and the black, and that was part of the Peter Max influence and the prompts from those artists, Frank Stella, and I just loved making this one with the high contrast, and it swirls and looks great from any angle. All right, next slide. This one I made with scraps, and it was I took a wedge class a couple years ago with a friend, and we were sharing fabrics, and so we used really cool fabrics, and then I kept them in a box for a long time and I wasn't sure what to do with them. And so the middle blocks are my with the way that I like to do curves, and then the corner pieces ended up being those wedge scraps, and I grabbed an all soft color palette. My kid Johnny, she says it looks like Candyland, like when I put it on the floor to take a picture, she could jump from block to block. And for me, I see I'm a founding member of the Rose City Rollers, a roller derby league here in Portland, Oregon, and for me it looks like our roller derby track, and it's a big oval.
Sing that one, Mom.
I have it. It's downstairs. You love it. Yeah, she likes it. Okay, next slide. This is one I called it Community. I shared it at showed it at Sisters Oregon outdoor show. This is just my response to what's going on in our society, and it seems like this is what people are asking, and it just feels so great to get those ideas out of my head in fabric. It out as a medallion quilt by Sarah Bond, and then it quickly just went into something else, and I put the words in there and the Beatles and Vans and fabrics and things that I really like seeing. So I really like this quilt a lot versus trying to make a pattern quilt, or I don't enjoy buying new fabrics very much. So I like using different fabrics and then creating my own, designs, like with the checkerboards and things. Like Maria Shell teaches us how to make our own design with fabric, which is really great. And I think that's it. Do I have another one? Oh, this is my big finale. This is like my finals piece. This one, this is my create the world you want to see quilt. Kind of see something, say something. This combines the Loudmouth block and then all these awesome pieces in the middle, the rainbow pieces that are very Maria Shell inspired from this class, kind of forcing me to slow down and create those checkerboard and rainbow pieces, because I can't, you can't find them in prints that have to be made by hand. And I want it noted for the record that I really did try to just use all solids, but that didn't happen. So I had to use some ice dyed stuff, and I have some vintage Barney fabric that I ice dyed for the purple, and for the outline for the lips, I did start making my own bias tape, but then someone gave me a box of vintage bias tapes, and so they're all different colors and they're coming out really cool, I think. So I just love this quilt and I'm so proud of it. I'm sorry that it's not finished, but my family had COVID all last week, and so that was of course when I was planning on sewing, and I sewed all day Sunday with my friends on Zoom, and this is as far as I got. But I love this quilt, and I really appreciate Maria Shell's I really appreciate the way you just created a safe space where it's okay to applique something if it's not going to fit this way. The teeth are FPP and the eyeballs FPP, and the middle eye and the center, the pupil are, applique, with the freezer paper and the gathering and the things. So it's a whole combination of techniques, this quilt, and it's not a fast to make, which is usually my thing, but each block is 20 by 20, so it's still really big. So I love this quilt, and I'm really excited to finish it. All right, thanks so much for having me in the class. It's been a really cool thing for me. I appreciate it.
Sorry,
Great.
folks, I muted myself and then I couldn't figure out how to unmute myself. Okay, thank you, Sarah. I actually love all of you guys using the found fabrics and the prints, and I think it's a distinct part of your voice, Sarah. So you don't have to use solids in this class. Barbara is our next presenter.
Thanks, Maria. So I started this class back in January, and Maria has talked a lot about finding a voice. And I'm not sure even now I know what that is, and I'm not quite sure I have one, but I'm working at it. My intention was really to stretch a little bit and try something new, and really step outside what I was comfortable with. I've been sewing for a number of years, but I'm a newer quilter, and have mostly up to now followed designs and patterns of others. So throughout COVID, I took a number of classes, online classes with different instructors to build some skills. I worked with Tara Fawnin, Sarah Bond, and Brenda Gale Smith. Next slide. I was interested in improvisational work a couple years back, and I tried my hand at this piece based on the work of Gwen Marston, who wrote a book called Liberated Quilt Making. This piece has a small companion piece with it, and that is quilted. I had that quilted by someone else. Next slide. Each month, as you heard, Maria provided 3 prompts to inspire us to create a work. I was usually drawn to the artist prompt, the under the influence prompt. Several of the artists were unknown to me, so I was able to learn about a new artist while taking inspiration from their work. This particular piece is inspired by the work of Sister Corita Kent. She was a Sister of the Immaculate Heart, a teacher, and born in 1918. Her early works were devotional, and mostly she did silkscreen work. So her works were often covered with poetry or devotional scriptural sayings. This work that I base this on was covered with a poem by Walt Whitman called "There Was a Child Went Forth Every Day." And it talked about how the child had experiences each day, and out of those experiences, good and bad, he built a life. Next slide. The next month, some life intervened for me, and I had cataract surgery. So it was a matter of about 6 to 7 weeks before I had both eyes, both surgeries done, and was able to get a new prescription for glasses and actually get new glasses. So during that time, the only thing I was comfortable doing was some straight line quilting and exploring color a little bit. So this one is based on a prompt of Frank Stella's work. Next slide. This piece was also inspired by Frank Stella and also Paul Klee. It kind of evolved a little bit organically. I wanted to try out that center space that someone else talked about. It's called interleaving, the process in the center square. The pointed arcs in the side pieces look a little bit wonky. I'm not sure they were quite intended to be that way, but this piece was is small and it's not yet quilted. Next slide. And finally, this last piece was inspired by another artist, Hilma af Klint. Hilma was a Swedish artist and a mystic born in 1862. And what I saw in a lot of her work was really some of that spiritual theme, the circular and kind of centering aspects of her work. That's my last slide. The class itself has been a tremendous journey for me. So thank you, Maria, and Elizabeth, of course. It's opened my eyes to a lot of new skills and techniques, and a brand new community of supportive stitchers. I have not yet done any machine quilting. So the second half of my next kind of stage of this journey is to try to learn some machine quilting and do that free motion quilting on my own home machine. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Barbara. I love this last piece. I think it's really is just a beautiful piece. Yeah. Okay, we have Michelle Maggs is next.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. During the past year, I've taken a couple of Maria's workshops, and I decided to take this 6-month journey as I needed to narrow my focus, to move away from traditional quilting and other people's patterns. Unfortunately, I was only able to be active for the first 4 months of stitching towards discovery, but I've been able to keep up with the virtual meetups and Facebook discussions in recent months. Part of my personal journey this year was investing in a long arm quilting machine and learning how to use it. It was delivered in April, and then I left home a few weeks later for extensive travel. So my work here is unfinished, but here are a few examples of my work from this time. So for the first slide, my first workshop with Maria was the Circle and Curves Sampler Workshop. Aside from learning improvisational curve piecing techniques, I enjoyed the challenge of coming up with the palette using colors and color combinations not typically used in my quilts. This was a lot of fun, and I want to continue experimenting with different color combos and layered curves on a larger scale. So the next slide, please.
I think
The
I have you
quilt,
got order a
oh,
little
excuse
bit.
me.
So
We're good.
so just watch, because you were talking about this one, which I had as number 2. So now this is number 1. Is this what you want to talk about next?
Oh,
Or
no, yep, yeah, this is good. Excuse me. Okay, so linear blocks is the next slide I wanted to talk about. And this one is still a work in progress. Basically, I hadn't decided the arrangement, but the blocks are done. Again, there was the same challenge for me just in coming up with a palette. It made for some fun and unexpected surprises, and it was a good exercise, giving me more confidence about choosing a color palette. And in this workshop, I learned different methods of creating bits and pieces, all cut without rulers, and putting them together in a somewhat pleasing arrangement. So next slide, please. And this is my response to one of Maria's prompts to create a monochromatic quilt using one shape and not using a ruler or any other shape. So I was able to stick with the monochrome and the one shape, but I did succumb to using a ruler for the final assembly of the units. Next slide, please. So on the next slide, this was my response to another prompt, which was to limit myself to one shape, but this time we were challenged to use various novelty prints and non-traditional textiles. So in addition to novelty prints, I used batiks, shock cottons, woven cottons, and silk. This was also my attempt at creating a sort of plaid-ish impression, something that I'd like to pursue further. So this year I created other original pieces that are still in progress using Maria's prompts. This experience has led me to appreciate the benefit of working in a series. I hope to continue with some of these prompts, making more satisfying quilts with each successive work in the series. Maria, the outstanding guest speakers, and the members of this group have shared countless useful and stimulating references. I'd like to thank all of them for their generous and helpful guidance this year and for inspiring me to take my work to the next level. So going forward, I intend to become a proficient long arm quilter and to develop a more personal quilting style while embracing improvisational cutting and design. So thank you, Maria, Elizabeth, and members of this group.
oh, thank you, Michelle. It's really nice. And I love this quilt. Super exciting. All right, Dave, you are our next presenter.
Thanks, Maria. Thank you. I'm going to share a little bit of the work that I've been doing over the last couple of months. Like others, this has been an opportunity to sort of experiment with new and different ways of doing things as I've been studying with Maria for a little bit over a year. Go to the first slide. So as an artist, I always perceive or do a lot of work in the sketchbook. And one of the things when I started this class, I made a priority to choose new projects or new things that I haven't done before. To that end, one of the things that I've made as a regular practice is that every time that I sit down to the sewing machine, I start by making a fabric sketch. These are a conglomeration of 9 out of lots of fabric sketches that represent a new strand of work that I'm pursuing, which I started with this class, which was using men's shirts or woven shirts to create piecework. And from the blocks to learn how to use a different material. Many of us in the class have experimented with non-traditional quilting materials. I think what I have learned, and you'll see in other pieces, is that there's a lot of challenges when we're using found fabrics that don't exist with other traditional quilting fabrics that bring us back to the roots of quilting, but also create interesting design and technical challenges. So one of the things I just want to elevate that I really enjoyed out of doing the sketches is this interaction of stripes. We often wear textiles that are commercial and capitalistic in origin, but we don't often think about how seam lines can have beauty. And many of the pieces or the sketches that you see sort of represent those pieces, because the things that are under a sleeve where two seams meet or a butt up end up having a lot of beauty that I'll expand on in future pieces. Not all of my sketches came from found fabric. The next slide. I also was doing a lot of experimentation with movement and trying to represent movement and in textiles. And so these started actually in the sketchbook, but then were rendered again in fabric, where I'm experimenting with using a very refined palette to show how things move in time. And further, we'll be experimenting with this concept. Next slide. Another one of my practices, often at the end of my working sessions, is that I've been making a series of very improvisational log cabin blocks that are all 5.5 inches by 5.5 inches. This is a small representation of a quilt that I think will ultimately be quite large. What's interesting about these fabrics are these are all fabrics based upon materials that I have worn. It also has not been made from any of the large parts of a shirt. So these fabrics that you see here are all made from the discards, typically, that as you're trying to quilt, you get rid of. Things like collars, things like sleeves, cuffs, ripping out interfacing, or perhaps the little bits that are still there. You'll see there's some, for example, some labels that are still left in. One of the things that I find really interesting about using found fabrics is I want to remind my remind my viewer about what the textile was originally, and I've learned that you can actually integrate them into the technique itself, and that makes the product, I think, a little more interesting. Next slide. This was the first whole quilt that I produced for the class. And in this class, or in this particular quilt, I wanted to experiment with a new form, which was in this case a medallion quilt, and explore an older quilting form, being the red and white traditional quilt that quilters have been using for years. And true to sort of Maria's methodology, I started making pieces, and from my pieces and bits, then I've constructed a design, and I used a mixture of traditional piecing techniques to resolve some of my design issues. The remainder of the quilts that you'll see, in fact, everything that you've seen so far, I don't use rulers. Everything sort of is more improvisational, and I really appreciate that. This piece will be gifted. And it has been quilted using a big stitch technique. Next. The next sort of form that I've been playing with a lot in the sketches is just the quarter circle. This particular quilt was the first quilt that I produced using shirting cottons. And I did a very simple sort of almost design and experimented with using or inserting skinny strips to supplement the design. It was the first time, though, that I learned of some of the challenges of working with shirting fabric. One of the challenges with working with shirting fabric, especially with doing curve piecing, is distortion in the fabric is magnified as you're putting pieces together. And I think this particular quilt, sort of what is achieved is sort of thinking about how pattern can turn into other visual objects that are pleasing. This has also been hand stitched, and the back was constructed with similar fabrics and has been gifted. Thank you. Next slide. So you've seen iterations of this that I showed earlier, but one of the things that I find that's very fascinating is that many of the common patterns in which we walk around with in our clothing have these elements that can be really interesting, design oriented, and can create optical illusions. So in this particular quilt, what I was trying to do was to take one of those interesting elements you saw in one of the sketches earlier and blow it out into a full design. Also, have an opportunity to see how you can take a pattern quilt or a pattern fabric, cut it up, and then make more pattern from it, which is something that you'll see in this quilt, in my final quilt. This is probably the beginning of a series of quilts where I plan to show or play with the optical illusions that are connected with stripes. In this case, you'll see that the inset stripes are at a 90-degree angle, which creates a particular effect when you piece them in a 90-degree angle, but I expect to explore that as I move forward. Additionally, all of the piecing here was done with straight lines and not super accurate, but I think it will be interesting to see how I can push that further by using more precise methods of piecing to generate movement from lines, and later more freehand piecing that involves curves. So I'm really excited about this as the origin of what I hope to become a series. My last piece that I'm showing is the one that I was up way late last night trying to fix. And in some ways is the thing that culminated all the work. And this particular piece was made from bits from 12 men's shirts that are on a colorway. And in this particular piece, I'm exploring what I see as middle class drag that we all wear, meaning a blue Oxford shirt or blue and white shirts indicate a particular set of class and privilege in our society. And in this particular case, I'm taking pattern and morphing it into objects that are a little surreal or a little symbolic in some ways, of circles that are floating around, which sort of, I think, can be connected in a lot of ways to our role in society. And so in this particular piece, I used circular piecing and wedges to construct circles, and then I cut it into fabric. You'll see some of my favorite elements, some pockets, some button bands, some cuffs that are integrated into the design, as well as my first whole circle piece, which was the last piece that was inserted in the bottom left to create this quilt. I'm looking forward to exploring this. I think I'm going to do 2 more quilts at least in this blue series, and I'm really looking forward to where that goes. Thank you, Maria. Thank you, Elizabeth, for the inspiration of the course, as well as everyone that I met in the class. I look forward to future work.
Yeah, thank you, David. And now another New Yorker, Katie O'Brien.
Hi, I'm Katie O'Brien, and I live in Brooklyn, New York, with my husband and 4 kids. I've been quilting for almost 20 years, and I'm always I learned as a traditional quilter, so this is kind of all new technique for me. Next slide, please. So this is the first quilt I ever made in a class with Maria Schell. And I followed the guidelines of using solids and no ruler and just one block that's repeated over and over again. So that was all kind of new for me. At the end, I decided to call it Mother of 4 in a Pandemic, because when I looked at it, it just really felt like how I was feeling. It's kind of overwhelming. It's very busy. It's chaotic. There's a lot going on. But I also think it's ambitious and it's beautiful. And it was the first quilt I ever made that I looked at it and it felt like me and it felt like what I was feeling. So it really changed the course of the way that I quilt. This is the first piece that I created for this course, and I called it Shaking Off Shell because I wanted to incorporate what I had learned in the previous class, but this class, the goal is to find your own voice. So I wanted to bring back things that were important to me and not follow the guidelines so stringently. So this class, I still did no ruler, this quilt, no ruler, but I was very careful. It took me a very long time because I do like the straight lines. I use traditional blocks, and I use prints because I always find prints really inspiring. So I brought that back in. And so this is my first attempt to do my own voice. This next slide is in response to the prompt, make a quilt with just one shape. And I was looking out my window and I thought, oh my gosh, all I see is rectangles. Every single thing is a rectangle. So I'm really inspired by Brooklyn. I like living here. I just find it a really vibrant place to be. I love Fort Greene and I love my community. So this is a kind of a love letter to Brooklyn. It's also a little bit of a comment on the community. There's just huge economic disparity in this borough. And, you know, the novelty prints are definitely just like a fun and whimsical, but it's also, if you notice, there's only birds living in one place. The snails live somewhere else. The cats live somewhere else. So it is in some way a social comment on the segregation of the borough in a way. This quilt is called Cassiopeia in Plaid. So I was really inspired by the people in the class. And as I was looking at everyone else's quilts and the beautiful things they were making, I decided to try to make some of my own prints. And you can see I have just a flat background where my previous quilts were busier because I wanted the prints and the blocks to shine. So Cassiopeia is a constellation made up of 5 stars, and that's what this is. This is the final quilt that I made for this class. It's the Wabi-Sabi Garden. So the prompt was Wabi-Sabi, and from my understanding, it's a Japanese principle that's about appreciating the imperfections in nature and in aging. So when I started the quilt, I thought, okay, I'm going to do very organized garden, an orderly garden, and then have it kind of bloom asymmetrically. So when you first look at the quilt, you might think it seems orderly and straight, but as you spend some time with it, you can see these 3 center diamonds are not in the center. They're on the right side of the quilt and they're towards the top of the quilt. And the purple diamonds that are kind of in the notches are not, there's only 3 going along the top and 4 going along the bottom. And as I moved these things into the quilt, the lines are not straight. Things start looking a little skewed. There's also ant prints that are kind of marching all over the quilt, and some fallen purple petals all over the quilt. So I think, you know, if Wabi-Sabi is this appreciation of imperfection and that's what makes it special and beautiful, I thought it was kind of a great way to wrap up this particular class, because I think that's all about what your voice is. You know, it's your own imperfect, but yours, what you make with your own hands, and it's special and it's worth celebrating. So I really enjoyed this exploration and the journey in this class of moving away from following patterns and just creating my own designs and my own palette and just following my own, what I enjoy. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie. All right, we have Carol Lee is next.
Okay. Hi, I'm Carol Lee. I was first introduced to Maria's quilts through her book, Improv Patchwork. I made a couple of quilts on my own from her book and took my first class with her through Road to California in 2020. And I will continue to take classes with Maria. You will have to forgive me, my presentation is brief. I'm just ending my COVID 2 weeks, so don't get it, wear a mask. Next slide. This is the first quilt. It's Improv Log Cabins. I enjoyed the colorful log cabins. I did have a palette It was a fun quilt to make. Next slide. One of the prompts in Stitching Towards Discovery is line. And this is my line quilt. Next slide. This is Circle and Curves. I love how it turned out. It's matchstick quilted, and it's very straight and fun, and I love it. Next slide. This is the cross block quilt. I enjoyed making all these little tiny crosses. Very happy. Next slide. This is using quarter log cabins. I like how the border turned out. Next slide. This is Blow It Up. I took a traditional star block and enlarged it. And the next one. This is one of my favorite artists, Hundertwasser, a last name that he made up. The quilt's influence is of onion domes and Hundertwasser's artistic influence. The cathedrals and churches with their multiple domes look like huge chandeliers. The onion shape results from the idea of prayer as a soul burning towards heaven, which connects the earthly world with the treasures of the afterlife. Onion domes appear on Catholic churches all over southern Germany. Onion domes were also a favorite of 20th century Austrian architectural designer Friedrich Hundertwasser. Hundertwasser depicted onion domes in his work. My husband, Klaus Schugraf, was German. He immigrated to the United States, having just completed his PhD in physics. Klaus is buried in an old cemetery in Heidhausen, Munich, in his great-grandfather's grave. Heidhausen is one of the oldest green areas in Munich. The cemetery was overgrown, the trees covered almost completely. It is surrounded by high brick walls. This creates a special mood. The cemetery is a haven of peace and in this lively district. My quilt celebrates the character of my husband, the enthusiasm of his spirit, both German and American, the traditional and the modern. It is a celebration of the past European influence and the American dream. Thank you.
Thank you, Carolee. Carmen.
Hi, I'm Carmen Sidlerud from Twin Falls, Idaho. I have been quilting off and on for over 35 years. I share my quilting journey with my twin sister. So go to the first slide, please. So this first quilt was not made in Maria's class. It was actually my first foray into improv piecing. It did use a ruler, but the arranging of the blocks on the design wall were very random, yet with purpose, geared by the color. The techniques were learned in an online forum with Claudia Fiel of Germany in 2020 and 2021. This used to combine, sorry, I already said that. So I love the process of discovering the personality of this quilt as I worked. I took it beyond Claudia's techniques and added 3D elements to bring the scene to life. Maybe this should have been called Butterfly Garden rather than Sunflower Garden. The butterflies are all a origami folded technique. Next slide, please. This quilt scaled spokes was, I created it during the Maria's class, complex patterning. The structure is based on an old wagon wheel and hub that adorn my garden. I reduced the number of spokes to allow large enough spaces to insert piece patterning based on the colors and patterns found on tropical fish. Next slide, please. This quilt was the first one I created during this this journey in Stitch for Discovery. It was in response to the prompt origin story. The design came from a piece of fabric that actually inspired the layout, but the quilt itself represents the ins and outs of the art journey my twin sister and I have shared. I quilted words on some of the logs to identify our joint and individual art pursuits. This quilt initiated a series of quilts exploring this undulating shape. Next slide, please. Making Waves was the second in the undulating shape series. It was created in response to the prompt exaggeration. It also utilized, I did some piecing that was reminiscent of an artist soul duet that I found as I web surfed following one of Maria's clues for another artist. I explored ways to fill the undulating shapes with different patterns of line, including straight and wavy lines of various spacing and colors. I can't wait to get this quilted. It is currently sitting on one of my long arms and started, but that's as far as I've gotten. Next quilt. This quilt called Lava Lamps. The name came from one of my classmates, which I thank her. I think it was Barbara, but I am not sure. It started as a sketch with the intent of exploring foreground and background. Although use of ombre fabrics veered away from that original exploration, I like the way they added directional movement as the lava lamps flow around this piece. I plan to quilt this with patterns that will add to this sense of movement. Next slide. This quilt telling their story was continued with the same shape in that series. It was created in response to the prompt Wabi-Sabi. Because of the Wabi-Sabi prompt, I used materials at hand and did not continue to pursue my bright colors that I love. I repurposed fabric from my father-in-law's silk ties and silk skirts and jackets that he had made for my mother-in-law as a clothing designer. The quilt represents their journey as immigrants and leading and guiding of God, represented by the lighter flower in the center, through the ups and downs of life as they fled their oppressive homelands following World War II. Next slide. This quilt, Color Wheel Unraveled. I continued to work with that undulating shape, but this actually started as a color wheel that I had the pieces for a color wheel that I had cut out and prepared probably 25 years ago and never sewn together. I put it on my design wall with the intention to make that, but in response to the prompt transparency, I decided that it was a good jumping off point. I put my color wheel together in a different manner, cut it up in strips, and began playing on the design wall. Although I started with a sketch, I never followed it. This truly was, as a term I learned from their lecture from Irene Roderick, Dancing with the Wall. It grew as I worked to develop its own personality, as I incorporated and rejected various components. Fitting all those curved pieces together was my biggest challenge. There are a few areas I think I'm going to need to fix before I tackle the quilting on this. It has been a fun and challenging to work in a series following provided prompts and some prompts of my own. Through the course of this study with Maria, I've gained the confidence to tackle a quilt I designed over 10 years ago. with construction challenges that intimidated me. I also in the future plan to not only put that quilt together, but to plan to work on a series inspired by my twin sisters' macro floral photography. And I thank Maria and Elizabeth and all of the participants for the encouragement, the guidance, the instruction. This has been a wonderful experience.
It really has been a wonderful experience. Thank you, Carmen.
Yes, thank you.
All right, Lisa Walsh from Canada.
Hi. Hi. Yeah, the lone Canadian here. But anyways, I'm Lisa Walsh. I live in Calgary, Alberta, Canada with my husband, son, and 2 bulldogs. I'm a quilter. I have loads of experience PC and traditional patchwork, but I'm very new to improv. I'm a nurse clinician at Sheldon Schumer Urgent Care, which is a busy downtown facility. So I find quilting is a peaceful retreat for me. And these last 7 months have really come in very helpful. And you can go to the next slide. So this is my first improv quilt. I made in Maria's class, Linear Blocks. Every time I look at it, I'm reminded of the Trailer Park Boys series I binge watched while making this. And the colors remind me of Haribo candy, so I named it Picoballa Boys. I used the 12 color palette exercise, and I learned the importance of making sure each color can stand alone, and also that gray doesn't suck the life out of all the other colors. Being my first improv, I learned how helpful a seam ripper is, to use a sketchbook, to take notes, and to pay attention to measurements when fitting everything together. And next. Hatchlings is my second improv piece made in riffing on tradition. I took a favorite block, the cross square, and used the 12 color palette again. This time I found I was stretched to manipulate the shapes to work in an all over layout. My seam ripper was well used again, and I grew to actually like the colors red and purple. And note that I say like, not love. Next. Hey Joseph was inspired by Joseph Albers and his series Homage to the Square. I worked in a monochromatic color palette of one of my favorite colors, and I softened the clean lines by hand quilting Baptist fans to emphasize the fact that it's a quilt. It wasn't intentional to quilt the pattern upside down, but by the time I noticed it, I thought it was kind of a happy mistake, so I just let it be. Next. This is my ocean medallion. I chose this palette in response to the prompt of ocean. I grew up in Vancouver, British Columbia, and I wanted to bring in the blue sky and water and the summer sunshine. This piece shows I'm well on my way to cutting without a ruler, but my trusty seam ripper is still at my side. And next, thanks, Sarah. While I had so far been cutting without a ruler, I wanted a break and use the prompt of lines with this piece. I challenged myself to see how straight and how far I could keep my lines in order, and I used black and white to keep the lines as clear and clean as possible. And next. All right, so I'm back. I threw away the ruler again. And this was made in Maria's class of improv. It had me use colors assigned by the letters of my name, and shapes were decided by chance. If any of you guys have the opportunity to take this class, take it. It's fabulous. I found the process a lot of fun as I let go of control, and I lost the fear of wasting fabric. I performed surgery on what I thought was a boring block from another abandoned project and ripped it apart using the arcs to make that circular unit. And next. Well, I hadn't really enjoyed using red so much before. I was quite happy with the palette from the previous top, and so I expanded on it, eliminating the blue. I added grays and found my newest favorite shade, which is called Potter's Clay, which is kind of a pinkish taupey gray. And next. Oh, Colleen, I'm talking about Game of Improv. So this one's Arlo, and to make Arlo, I used the prompt of using one shape overall, and I chose the quarter log cabin. Using that previous palette again, it was quite enjoyable rearranging the units on the design wall, and the final layout was my son's choice. And I am 100% embracing red and gray now. So just in conclusion for my talk, I just wanted to say these last 7 months, I've learned so much, and I thought I'd give my top 3 of the things I learned. Number 1, I can't force authenticity. I can simply relax and allow it to come around. Number 2, I can actually create work that reflects me and my spirit. And number 3, if you don't love something, you don't have to persevere, except when it comes to seam rippers, red and gray. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. That's awesome. All right. And our final presenter tonight is Diane Wold.
Hi, this is me at my sewing machine with my sewing assistant, Sunny. So next slide. Whoops, we missed one. Do you have the big flower?
No, I had it in here and I took it out.
Okay.
And I'm not sure why I did, because I'm
That's
sorry,
okay.
Diane.
We'll keep going. Yeah. The big flower that isn't
First you're
here
gonna
was
say, you did this incredible big botany quilt, and that is the quilt we're not seeing. And I will make sure that it will be the cover photo for this YouTube video, so everybody will see it then.
Yeah. So that was that quilt was the first quilt that I made in a class with Maria. That was last summer. It was big botany. It's a big flower. Some of the things that were new for me in that class were the improv quilting. I've done some improv before, but not a lot, and working exclusively with solids because I've mostly been a print person. This is the first quilt that I did for this class. The prompt was something like, if you were a quilt, what would you look like? And I chose to go to my mathematics background for the inspiration for this quilt. This is done improv with solid fabrics. The 7 strips here illustrate the 7 symmetries, which are fundamental to any repeating pattern on a strip. There's 7 of them. Those are them. Next slide. So I sort of abandoned the improv piecing and the solid fabrics in this one. This was in response partly to the monochromatic prompt and partly to the prompt about using one shape only. So the shape here is triangles. This does follow on from the last quilt in that, again, there are 7 strips that illustrate those 7 strip symmetries. Next one. Another triangle quilt, although there are actually no triangular shaped pieces here. This is another mathematical idea called a cellular automaton. The very first row there was generated randomly, and after that, each succeeding row is determined by a rule. So although this process creates patterns that sort of look like random triangles, once the first row is set, the rest is determined. Anyway, so that was sort of a tangent on triangles. Next one. So this is also triangles. This is going back to the improvisational piecing and mostly solids. I called this feathered triangles because it reminded me of the traditional quilt patterns that are called feathered stars, which have little triangles around the points of the stars. In order to get the little triangles to come out even around the sides of the big triangles, you can't just wing it. You have to know what measurement you're heading for. So in that way, it's pretty controlled. Once I made the individual triangles, putting them together was one of those improv challenges. When you do improv piecing, making the individual elements can be pretty free, but then when you want to get them together into a surface, then it's hard work sometimes, but it worked out. Next quilt. So I sort of headed in a different direction for this one. This is based on a traditional quilt pattern, which has come up before in this presentation, a quarter log cabin. So in a traditional block, where that star is would be the beginning, and then there would be strips sewn onto it to fill out the block. And in this case, the strips are improv pieced, what Maria calls bits. And I used higher value contrast and prints in that center block and grayed down solids in the background to have a contrast between the foreground and the background. Next slide. So this is the last of the pieces. Here we've got a mix. It's all solids. Some of those have a little texture in them, so they're not just solids. And the pieces are improv pieced, but the circles were cut with a template. And this was in response to a prompt about using 4 kinds of patterning. So the 4 kinds of patterning here are the X's, the checkerboards, the triangles, and then the polka dots that are in the edges around the circles. This is based on, visually, it's based on aerial views of farmland. I actually went to Google Maps and found a piece of Kansas to use. And it's the kind of farmland where irrigation is done by these circular irrigation systems. So that was the inspiration behind this. And where am I going next? I'm doing more things based on aerial views, and I don't know, we'll see where it goes. I do all kinds of techniques. I feel that now I have some new techniques that I can use when I want to, that I learned in this class. And I really enjoy the texture that I get with this kind of intensive piecing. So that's it.
Thank you, Diane. And I want to say that concludes our presentations. I'm going to stop the slideshow, and I don't, if there's any questions or comments as we wrap this up. Don't know if there was anything in the chat that.
A lot of positive comments.
Yeah, it was great. I really appreciate all of you signing in and participating and seeing the presentations of the students from Stitching Towards Discovery. We are going to do it again next January. It'll be a little bit shorter, but a similar format. And yeah, if you guys have questions, people have questions, you can send me an email and I will try and answer it. So I just really appreciate all of you and the opportunity to work with you, and that you did this big ta-da, which I had been, I don't know, in my head, I'm like, I just feel like having a presentation helps you sort of see your work as a whole and to see, you know, what's happened. A lot of times we don't look backwards, and it can be really helpful. So, all right, I guess this recording will be, I'm going to download it, upload it, and it'll be on my YouTube channel, and I'll post it some other places. So you should be able to find it on my Instagram and that sort of thing. All right. Thank you, students, so much for spending this time together. I think it was really wonderful. So, all right, we will say goodbye. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. It's wonderful.
Thank you.
So much. Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.